Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Higher Ed Live Special Edition for Wednesday, December 18th. This is the final Higher Live episode of 2019. So I hope everyone has had a terrific fall semester. Good luck to all your students. For those of you who still have students who are in the midst of finals week, I'm Rob Zinkin, and this is my first episode since moving from Indiana University to a new role now as Vice President at RHB, coming to you from sunny downtown Indianapolis in the RHB offices today. We are closing out 2019 in a big way with SNHU President Paul Leblanc. Before I introduce him, a reminder that Higher Ed Live Special Edition is part of the Higher Ed Live Network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. You can be a part of our live broadcast. Use the hashtag HigherEdLive on Twitter. Join the discussion. Share any questions that you'd like to pose to today's guest. All episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you missed last week's Marketing Live episode with Liz Gross about TikTok, that podcast episode is out there, so be sure to check that one out. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. M. Stoner teamed up with Target X to design a survey focused on how prospective teen students use a range of digital tools, social media, websites, email, and digital ads during their college search and selection process, and learned what information is most helpful at each stage of the journey. This 2019 digital admissions research offers rich insights into the nuances of their behavior as they make a vital decision in their lives. In October, Michael Stoner, president of M. Stoner, and Sasha Peterson, CEO of Target X, presented a first look at the research findings and gave recommendations on where colleges and universities can focus digital enrollment marketing time and energy to most effectively connect with prospects. We'll tweet out a link shortly where you can sign up to receive early access to the digital admissions white paper in early 2020 before it is publicly released, and instant access to the on-demand digital admissions presentation and slide deck. Today's episode is sponsored by RHB. RHB has been providing clarity and confidence for higher ed marketing since 1991, solving the marketing, enrollment, and advancement challenges for more than 200 colleges and universities around the world. From research and strategy to organization design and slate integration, RHB helps institutions maximize student lifetime value by aligning marketing intelligence with technological relevance. Student lifetime value means value to both the institution and to the student over their lifetime, and it's a manifestation of our guiding principle of coherence. We'll be tweeting out links to some of RHB's most popular posts for higher ed marketers in 2019. And if you want more, rhb.com/insights is the place to go. You'll find a wealth of insights there, including a must-read two-part piece on getting real about population decline. Okay, I am delighted to welcome our guest today, President of Southern New Hampshire University, Dr. Paul Leblanc. Paul, so great to be with you today.
Rob, I'm delighted to be with you as well. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think our listeners, higher ed leaders and practitioners, are certainly aware of SNHU's rise and its remarkable growth under your leadership, from just under 3,000 students when you came in 2003 to now well over 100,000 learners. What some may be less familiar with is your own story and upbringing as an immigrant family, as a working class kid, and a first-generation college student. So could you share a bit about your journey and how education as a gateway to hope and to opportunity is really personal and meaningful to you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've lived, and it sounds hokey sometimes, but a version of the American dream, right? The sort of classic one that we think about so often. My parents had eighth grade educations. We lived in a rural, hard-scrabble part of the Maritimes of Canada, hard place to make a living. So sometimes people have called it Canadian Appalachia. We immigrated when I was 3, settled in the Boston area. My mom worked in a factory, actually till she was in her mid-70s. My dad was a day laborer. So I was the first person in my family to go to college. But we didn't know anyone who went to college. Like, no one in our neighborhood went to college. And, you know, thanks to teachers, it's always teachers, right, who took me under their wing in high school and said, and then, you know, actually all the way back, my mom, right up till the day she died at 96, recalled a parent-teacher conference with Mr. Schlafman, my sixth grade teacher, who said, Paul is college material, could go to college someday. And this hit her like a lightning bolt, because that was something that the children of other people's kids, those are other people's kids who went to college. She cleaned houses as well, and in these very wealthy suburbs of Boston. And she would plunk me down in the library. I spoke French before I spoke English, and I would sort of look at kids' books while she cleaned their houses. Their kids went to college. So we often talk about poverty, financial poverty, but there's a poverty of aspiration in many parts of our culture. And being able to dream a bigger dream started with that conversation, and really access to affordable, for me, a combination of public and private higher ed changed everything. It changed the trajectory of my life. And I fear the driver for me is I feel like that dream is further out of reach of more and more people in our country.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I was able to do that without a lifetime of debilitating debt, for example. Mm-hmm. I worked construction every summer and could mostly pay my tuition on the base. Who could do that now? No summer job makes enough money, right? Unless you're a stockbroker, perhaps, but not a typical college kid job.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly want to discuss some of those issues and challenges and how you're addressing them at Southern New Hampshire. And I'd like to start and end our conversation today around books. You mentioned books, and we'll see where we go in between. And would like to begin with the book Choosing College by Michael Horn and Bob Mesta, and specifically the jobs to be done theory, which is about understanding the job for which customers hire a product or a service. At the AMA Symposium for the Marketing of Higher Education last month, which you've keynoted before, a keynoter there cited data that the number one reason Americans value higher education is to get a good job. Not surprising.
Yep.
The book, though, is enlightening and showing that it's more complicated than that. It's more nuanced than that, that, in fact, higher education does many jobs for many kinds of students. And so I'd be interested to hear how you would describe the jobs to be done theory framework to a novice and how it has served as a playbook for you and the leadership at Southern New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's the work that has been highly influential for us. And the old sort of accent that probably everyone has heard, which is, people don't buy drills, they actually buy holes. The job to be done is a hole, not a drill. So when you think about this in a more complicated context like higher ed, everyone will say, I want a degree as a pathway to unlock a better job or a better career. But in many ways, that's table stakes. Like that, yeah, sure. Okay, but that's a given. So then what is the job to be done? So in Bob and Michael's book, they talk about, the typical kid leaving high school typically has 5 different jobs, one of which they sort of hold primary. And it can be, it's what I'm supposed to do. It's just the step. You supply the step. And everything has told me this is whether I have a passion, curiosity, intellectual interest, that's what I do. Another is escape. I want to get out from under my, the great freedom that is going off to college. We often talk about it on our traditional campus as 2 jobs. We offer a degree that unlocks opportunity, and then we offer a coming of age experience. That's the campus. And the coming of age experience is everything else. It's where you live, study abroad, the student organizations, the teams. It's the ability to reinvent yourself. It's long conversations with great faculty and advisors who help you think about the big questions or help you care about the big questions. You might not come with those questions. And that's a job that we spend enormous amounts of money on across higher ed. Like if you just take a look at your typical campus, so much of what we're spending is not on the academic side, it's on the coming of age side. If you go on a typical tour, an admissions tour, I tag along sometimes. There are a set of perfunctory questions that get asked about academics, often, by the way, in a session separate from the tour. And then the tour spends all of the time saying, okay, do you have this team? Can I volunteer? I love working with animals, right? All of this other stuff. And the whole time, that student and his or her parents are sizing up the tour guide, the people they see, is this who I want to be? Is this the place I want to be? Now jump to our 30-year-olds who are, typical online student for us is a 30-year-old. 86% of them are working. Most have kids. 19% are veterans. I would argue that they have had all the coming of age they can stand. They know what they're about. They have grown up. They have sacrificed. So they tend to want some other things from us. So same table stakes, get me a degree that will unlock an opportunity. but the job they need us to do is actually really tied to the constraints of their life. So deliver it to me in a way that's incredibly convenient. I got a job. I got kids. You want me to go to a campus at 5:30 p.m.? I'm going to eat fast food in the parking lot. I'm going to come to class. I'm going to miss my kids. They're going to be in bed by the time I get home. This doesn't work really well. If I can instead go home, be with my kids, have dinner at the table, put the dishes away, read them a bedtime story, put on my slippers, make a cup of tea, and log on at 9:30, now you're getting the job done. That's the job I need you to do. And there are 4 jobs that we typically come back to for adult learners. 4 aspects of the job, excuse me. Make it convenient, make it affordable, make my completion time as fast as you can, because this is a hard thing, and I feel some urgency. If I'm going back, it's because there's some pressures on me. And typically it's the pressure to do better. I got to take better care of my family. So will you accept as many credits as I have? Typically 80% of our adult learners have credits, and credits from multiple institutions. What will get me to the completion line as fast as possible? And then credential. So is this credential actually going to work for me? Is it the right credential? Is it something I can do? So we call it it's the 4 C's, right? It's convenience, cost, credential, and completion. Mm-hmm. And those are the jobs. So a lot of schools that try to move into the online space, in my experience, don't recognize that job to be done. And they take a whole bunch of things that they do for 18-year-olds on a campus, and they simply try to port it over and say, here you go. And it doesn't work very well. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, hearing it. The real last example, Rob, and if you think about the financial aid discussion we have with a high schooler or a freshman on campus, it started probably in the junior year of high school. That was when we first began that long admissions process, materials, visits, winning out, et cetera. We try to have that, so that's 2 years. We try to have that conversation in 2 days with an online learner, because one of their big primary issues is cost, and can I even afford this? Am I crazy to think I could go back? If we can give them that answer and we can find ways to make it work for them, then we remove the barrier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another reason that this book and the framework resonated with me is that as a marketer, we're supposed to represent the voice of the customer or the stakeholder or the audience and bring to the table an intimate understanding of the people that we're trying to serve, we're trying to motivate. And with jobs to be done, it even goes beyond that in trying to, just as you talked about, address people's circumstances, how you talked about the needs of adult learners, of contemporary students, and the progress that they are trying to make in that particular circumstance. So from your experience with it and the research, how does this framework get at root causes and causal implications? Because we know that people are generally not very good at predicting their future behavior, and that people are not very good at providing accurate causes for past behavior.
Yeah, and it's really, so I think 2 different things here, and one of the things we're spending a lot of time now talking about is the extent to which we truly understand the learner, and obviously a taxonomy of learners, because there are many learners that you serve at scale or even in smaller scale. And I think so much of traditional higher ed has been largely a one-size-fits-all. So if you're at institution X, I'm going to go back to kind of a traditional campus. The institution positions itself as gatekeeper. Yes, we'll invite you to come. We've given you an offer letter and we've given you some financial aid. But the educational experience is largely a one-size-fits-all experience. And it's built around what the institution thinks is important for itself. This is how we do things. This is how we build our curriculum. This is why our intro to psych course is so much better, and why we won't accept credits from another institution who also teaches intro to psych, right? I mean, if you think about the inefficiencies that come with this thinking, but very little of that is built for the individual learner. And it's very hard to have an individual pathway through an institution. If you and I both enroll as English majors at school X, we'll have some different electives. You might minor, I might not. You may play sport, I may not. But generally speaking, our experience through that institution is going to look a lot alike. In fact, we kind of bank on it. I think the future of education is going to ask us to think differently about this. We live in a world of customization at scale. And we're going to need to understand individual learners and the root. So when you go to root cause, like, I need to understand as much as I can about you. And I'm not going to understand you in those ways simply through an admissions essay and an SAT score any longer. I want to know your grit. I want to be able to measure your perseverance. I want to know as much as I can about your aptitude. I want to know the baggage that you carry with you. If I'm going to serve underserved populations, I want to know about, adverse childhood trauma. We know now, right, from learning science that has an impact. I also want to learn as much as I can about your other external constraints. These are questions, again, we don't tend to ask. Do you have pressures to get through faster? Do you have financial constraints that I need to know about? Not in your ability to pay, but your willingness to take on debt, your other financial obligations. Do I know how much you're going to work during the time that you're with me? And if I could sort of take all of that, if I can distill all of that, the holy grail is to then curate for you a learning pathway that's really well suited to you. Rob is going to learn in this way, and it's going to be based on how he learns, what we can map to his cognitive abilities, what we know about his life. We might say to you, Rob, you came to us to talk about an associate's degree, but everything we know about you says you need to get a job like in the next 6 months. That's what you're really talking about. You think you need an associate's degree. You don't. I can give you this sub-degree experience that results in this kind of credential that will guarantee you, almost guarantee you, a job, let's say a Salesforce administrator. I can get you there in under a year, and you can start at $75,000. But don't stop. Come back to us, right? Let us scaffold your learning. You need a degree at some point. So we're really trying to build what is, in some ways, a learning ecosystem that it serves a much broader range of students, starting with understanding in a very deep way the needs of any individual learner. Sorry, that's a mouthful. But
no, there's so much there.
Future.
Mm-hmm. And it points to the investments that you've made in student advising and the significance of that role. So many things that I want to touch on there. I do want to ask one additional question about the jobs to be done theory, yeah, Paul, and that framework. And I know that you have a workshop on that in the beginning of 2020. How do you continue to use that, or do you continue to utilize that as a playbook, if you will, for Southern New Hampshire?
Yeah, so almost any initiative, any new project, any proposal here almost invariably begins with, what job are we doing here? Are we clear about the job we're being asked to do? Look, you can ask this sometimes in terms of what problem are we trying to solve, but initiatives are problem solving, right? I have this great idea. I think we should do X. Okay, who's going to pay us to do X? And what is X really doing? So again, if you walk onto campuses quite often and say, what job do you think you're doing? That's it. We're educating students. And you are marketing, right? So in marketing, it's all about our education. And I think a lot of people on campus understand, well, yeah, of course, that's table stakes, as I said earlier. But we have to do a whole bunch of other things if we want that student to be interested in us, because they have this other job they need to be done. So we ask it early, and we ask it often, and we come back to check on it again. Did we get the job right? How do we know we got the job right? What would tell us that this is the right job to be done? And when you ask people, and I think what Bob, Moesta, and Michael, I think, are really good at, they don't often know right away, right? You have to dig deep, I think, to your earlier question. You have to be in that conversation and asking the right questions to really get at the job to be done. I mean, if you stopped any tour on campus and said, why are you here? What's the job you're trying to get done? Say, I'm getting education. I need to get a good job someday. Mm-hmm. Now let's go deeper. Yeah. And when you talk to a student who says, God, I have no idea what I want to do, and you say, did you love school? And they go, no, I really didn't like school that much, but you're signing on for 4 more years of school? Tell me about that. It's like, well, my parents say, like, you got to go to college. Like, you have to go to college if you want a good job. There's a different job that has to get done there. And how do we think about that? And is that a job we're prepared to do? Right. So, yeah, is that helpful?
Yeah, it's super helpful, and certainly would recommend to higher ed colleagues to dig in further to the book and read Choosing College, and lots of insights. And it was an eye opener for me as well. Yeah.
And as you said, Bob and Michael are hosting a conference next month here on our campus. We just happen to be the site of it, but I think that's a great place to go deep into this theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we talk about the future of higher education, Paul, and the reshaping of higher education, and I love the phrase, the concept that you referenced earlier in terms of a learning ecosystem. It's so easy for us to get caught up in all the doom and gloom, but there's also unprecedented opportunity, certainly, when we think about the future of higher ed. So what are the cool things, for lack of a better term, that you're most excited about when you think about higher education, how it can or how it will change in the coming decade?
So I love the fact that we are increasingly comfortable with breaking down the traditional silos. And I often say here, we know we're on the right road when we can as easily accommodate a 10th grade girl working on her associate's degree as a 64-year-old formerly incarcerated adult who needs a high school degree. Like, that's the ecosystem. We want that range, and we want to break out of the traditional sequencing. So our thesis is that a future higher ed ecosystem will have the traditional degrees will remain not only really important, but they may be the most important milestones. But I think we'll see a lot of credentials in between. So I think we'll see a proliferation of micro-credentials, whether we call them nano degrees or badges. We haven't sorted that out yet. This is a new movement. So as you know, new movements require clear taxonomy and agreed upon nomenclature. Still working on that, but it's happening, right? This proliferation of new degrees, sub-degrees, and micro-credentials, and people are working at this furiously. I think it's super exciting. And I think the second piece will be that we will see a lot of other new providers of learning, and that higher ed will actually, and I think this is a good thing, will not hold its monopoly power over where one goes for learning. I actually think that historically, the value add of much of higher education has been in the curation of learning, creating curriculum, choosing the right textbook, creating the learning experiences, and then delivering them, kind of the role of the faculty. I think that value add in a world where content is increasingly ubiquitous, more than we consume, and often and increasingly free, the value add won't be in that. Learners will have lots of options about how to learn. When I look at young people today, their first instinct is to go to YouTube. That's where they learned, right? They're visual learners. So where will the value add of higher ed be? I think it will be in making sense of learning. So the sort of interpretation of learning, the assessment of that learning, and then the appropriate credentialing of that learning to reassure the world that this is what they know. We can say this with confidence, and this is the weight of that learning. Like, that's what we're really good at. But that's a very different way to think about our function and the job that we will do in the future. And we're not good at all aspects of that job. We're actually pretty poor when it comes to assessment, for example. Higher ed is. When I did a sabbatical at the U.S. Department of Ed as a policy advisor, we brought in an organization that's quite well known in the field of assessment to say, could you give the department a primer on assessment in higher ed? And they kind of came in and said, honestly, it's somewhere between dismal and miserable from a scientific, from a psychometrician's perspective, except where our life depends on it. So for things like doctors and nurses and pilots, we don't trust higher ed. We say, it's great that you got a 4.0 from University X in their flight program. We're still going to ask you to take the FAA exam. We're still going to ask you to take X number of hours in a simulator. We're then going to ask you to sit in the right-hand seat for a good long time under the watchful eye of the captain in the left-hand seat, who can attest to your mastery of skills and competencies, the ability to fly a plane safely and well. So where our life matters, we're pretty good, but we don't trust higher ed to do it. We actually look for other reassurance. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think competency is going to be a critical piece of that. I think historically, again, if we're talking about big paradigm shifts here, so if we're moving value from content creation delivery to assessment of learning and translating of learning and certification, I think another shift will be away from a spotlight on knowledge, where we just would infer what you could do with that knowledge, to actually shifting the light over to, no, tell us what you can do, and then surface your knowledge frameworks. But the primary thing is, can you actually do anything with what you've learned? So lots of engineers graduate and they can tell you the theory and they're really good at their exams. They may or may not be good engineers. We want reassurance now that you can do what you're supposed to be able to do. And this is, I think, again, in all of these problems, these severe problems facing higher ed that you mentioned, we're like going through a very tumultuous time, but they're forcing factors. I mean, the reality is because most of the workforce doesn't trust our industry any longer, that's a crisis, and that crisis can impel us towards much more rigorous work in key areas of improvement, like assessment. Mm-hmm. We can get the rigor back that I think to some extent we've lost.
Yeah. Again, lots of things there to delve into more deeply. One of which is your reference to the workforce and the growing distrust in higher education. And one thing that I appreciate in following you and your work and your leadership is how you look to other sectors and other industries for insights, for trends, for better understanding of consumer behavior. So I won't necessarily ask you for predictions as we think about the future of higher education, but are there changes? Are there market forces that may not be on people's radar that have implications for higher ed?
Sure. I think there are a number of things that we at least spend a lot of time thinking about. So we do look at other industries, and we're very interested in looking at healthcare and hospitals. Not typically a place to look for inspiration. They're kind of a broken industry in some ways, like we are. But if you think about it, the idea of the big hospital to which you could go with any ailment, and it would have every department, every testing laboratory, every specialist, they were all under one roof, and you went there and you could have any problem taken care of. Big, complicated machine. And if you think about what's happening in healthcare, we see a devolution of the big factory hospital to urgent care centers, minute clinics, telemedicine, remote medicine, right? Like there are all these other ways that we now think about healthcare, and we've devolved away. I think the campus is analogous to the big factory hospital, right? The idea that you would go to a campus and everything was there. I mean, literally like your fitness, your wellness, your food, your living, and then anything you wanted to study in a great university would be available somehow. And now what I think we're seeing is obviously we're seeing online education. You see places like Northeastern opening up some mini campuses. ASU just did something is opening up something in Los Angeles. You see dual enrollment. We're in high schools. And now, as I said earlier, I think we're going to see lots of other providers. So now you have boot camp. So you have Trilogy, right? Saying, okay, we'll work with universities and we're going to layer on coding, something you could do, but you don't for whatever reason. So you get all of this sort of dynamism. I think we're going to head in that direction. I think we will stop thinking about the campus as like the factory. Now, it may still be the nerve center in many ways, but it's going to have to extend itself in all kinds of interesting ways to deliver learning where people need it. And there's lots of mega trends that sort of inform that. I've spent a fair bit of time lately looking at AR and VR. I think it's going to revolutionize the way we learn. So I think immersive learning, if you've played with VR, you sort of get lost in it. I think certainly games are really immersive experiences. If you are a gamer, if you know people who play games, they literally won't look up for hours, right? Like it's so compelling, you're pulled in. And games that have intelligence sort of blur the idea of formative and summative evaluation. When you're in an immersive learning environment, we should know at any given point how much you know and what you can do, right? The game is testing that, and it's altering the environment for you. So I think it's going to absolutely revolutionize the way we think about the delivery of learning, and that we will see ourselves in much more immersive environments. And when you think about it, again, in high-stake professions like flight or medicine, we already do a lot of immersive learning, right? Simulations, et cetera, et cetera. Those are areas I think that are really, really exciting. And then, of course, the use of data. And look at all of these things come with difficult questions. So privacy, as soon as we see data, we say privacy and who owns data, et cetera. But these are things that are permeating every other industry. There's no reason to think they won't permeate ours. We have 75 people on our data analytics team. We measure everything. We measure our performance. We monitor classes 24/7. We monitor student performance. We proactively engage them as a result using a very powerful CRM. That's all driven by data. So a number of major factors, I think. And then, of course, platforms, right? So will learners continue to choose an institution for this sort of singular transaction where, we're all competing against each other? Or will it look something closer to a marketplace where I have a certain kind of learning And again, what we often say here is the future is the ability to deliver just the right amount of learning in just the right way, just the right kind. And that could be, I need a 2-hour deep dive on this one function within a programming language. I need a 2-day immersive on program management or project management because I have a new job coming up and I need to be better at it than I am, or 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. That's what we want to build to. But in that world, how do I find the right bit of learning? How do I find it at the right price? How do I find the right way? You start to think about marketplaces. So, everyone's nightmare, what happens if Amazon decides to figure out higher ed? They're really good at building marketplaces on platforms. Who knows? All really exciting stuff, full of opportunity.
Indeed. And as we broaden our understanding of learning, as you've described it, Paul, and the changes, the innovations, the responses that are required for institutions to take, how do we get there? The change and the resistance to change or pace of change. So you mentioned competencies and competency-based education. So at a rudimentary level, it seems pretty clear where compared to the credit hour where time is fixed and learning is a variable, we flip the script where time becomes the variable and learning is fixed. So I get that, I can grasp that, but the change or shift to that, as we know, is such a significant major one for higher ed. So when we think about change, when we think about these innovations and what higher ed needs to do, what are the barriers to innovation?
So I don't know if it's a barrier, but it's one of the things that tends to slow innovation, which is, if you think of journalism or music, those industries are disrupted overnight. Like they went off a cliff, right? Napster comes along, boom, blows up the whole business model of music. Craigslist comes along, and eBay comes along and blows up the underlying business model of newspapers. So I think in 1 year, and I want to say it's somewhere around 2006, you had the best year ever in terms of print revenue for print newspapers. And a year later, 350 papers went out of business, off a cliff. We're like healthcare, as I said earlier, right? We're a regulated industry. Regulated industries change at a slower pace because you have regulatory frameworks around financial aid, which is the lifeblood, right? 155 billion a year. So you have federal regulation around financial aid, you have state regulatory agencies, and then you have accreditation, or what's sometimes called the triad. I think all of them are wrestling with how do we support innovation better than we do today. And you see that. So when we started our work with competency-based education, CBE for short, we were the first to do direct assessment CBE, and NEASC at the time, now called NETGE, our regional accreditor, really worked hard with us to get their arms around this idea, and they were actually supportive. And I would generally say that the regional accreditors are much better on CBE than they were 4 years ago. They're making progress. However, the federal regulations around financial aid are still time-based. But there again, we just saw this week an announcement the Department of Ed is closing down one of the CB experimental sites, not because they're skeptical of it, because I think they're ready now to move towards a broader embrace. And there's bipartisan support on the Hill, and there are very few things for which we can say that, for CBE. And, you're right, it does move slow. But look at one of the 2 largest universities in the country is WGU. And that's a competency-based program with, about the same number of students as we have. Online was considered innovative for a long time. And now online is exploding across the industry, not just us. So we're big. Grand Canyon's big, Liberty's big, WGU's big, University of Maryland Global, all very large. The nonprofits have come storming back to take back the online market and spread that innovation. So you're not wrong, and we are moving too slow for what the country needs from us. But I think the big problem is, and the 2 biggest impediments to innovation at an institutional level, is if you have a lot of money and you have a sterling reputation. Those are the impediments to innovation, right? So if you think about where innovation happens, it often happens sort of on the margins. So Harvard and MIT were not going to do MOOCs, but they'll invest in edX and create a MOOC company. WGU was created out of whole cloth. We were an unknown little local school. ASU was the poor cousin to the flagship. All of you, right? So these are the places that sort of rose up to innovate. So I think it's a question of if you are in an institution that is held back by, again, reputation and a lot of money because you don't feel the pressure, the financial pressure, fewer and fewer schools fall into that category. The best thing you can do is start to carve out safe space, because it's very difficult to change the incumbent machine. And this is the lesson of Clay Christensen. So can the faculty and the faculty governance process continence the ability to create safe spaces for experimentation with assurances that if this becomes something, that it'll come back into the governance process? Can accreditors say to an institution, look, you want to do something that's very different and it's not in our standards, we're going to give you a sandbox. And you can put some guardrails around that sandbox. But my urging all the time is give people more safe spaces to experiment and don't beat them up when they get it wrong. Higher ed's terrible about this. We're very unforgiving of our failures, other people's failures especially. And what did they learn? You know, what do we know? Because if you're not failing sometimes, you're probably not innovating. As Mario Andretti said, you know, if you're not sort of just on the edge of careening out of control, you're probably not going fast enough.
In your case, where things have been going great, you are growing, how have you had to nurture a culture for innovation at SNHU?
So I think we first make a distinction between the kind of innovation. And we actually got a little lazy about this, and we're getting our discipline back. There are innovations that are about the core of what you do and making it better. And that's a certain kind of playbook. You don't need to separate that out. You want the people closest to the work actually owning that innovation, because they know, right? They know what has to happen to make things better. So what Clay Christensen calls sustaining innovation, taking what you do today and making it better. And those innovations are typically around, it's where you have a lot of certainty about the work and the hypothesis has been proven. And now what you're trying to do is find efficiency or quality improvements or scale or better outcomes. Then there's sort of a more disruptive kind of innovation. The first one is innovating within the rules of the game. The second one says, no, we actually want to sort of create we want to reinvent the game a little bit here. We want to think differently about the game. And there you typically want to get some distance from the incumbent, from the core, right? You can't ask the core to do that work because all of their incentives are built around doing this well and keeping this healthy and intact. So there, I think it's about splitting off. So when we did it here, and we wanted to grow online, the first thing we did is we took our little online department of 18 people and moved it off campus, out of sight, out of mind. And then we gave them permission to play by different rules, to use different policies, use different procedures, think differently about the work. And that got us started. Interestingly, when at that point, and we said, nope, we're going to move it to another place. So the incumbent always wants to take that new thing and treat it like the body treats foreign tissue. I'll either incorporate it and make it part of me, or I'll spit it out. And you got to create safe space outside the body to let that thing be nurtured. And I think that's what we spent a lot of time at leadership levels, I think, trying to persuade the culture to do what cultures do most poorly, which is change, right? The hardest thing to change is culture. So get it out of the culture, give it space to breathe for a while. And then there is an art, admittedly, to bringing it back in or not. If you bring it back in poorly, the incumbent will take it back. Remember GM and Saturn? So GM creates a whole new car company operating very differently. Saturn had a devoted following. They let it grow for quite a long while. And then what happened? As soon as they brought it in, they killed it. So you got to be really careful about that transition.
Great. Two more topics, and we could spend our entire time on any of these, but would still like to address the changing role of a college president and also marketing in our remaining time. Sure. And one thing I wanted to reference, a local publication here, Indianapolis Monthly, had a fascinating piece recently about the challenges that a private liberal arts college in this state is facing, and they're conducting a search for a new president. And in the piece, there was a comment from a faculty member who said, the job is impossible. You have alumni, students, the board of trustees, faculty, we all have the right answers, and we can't agree on anything. And you became a college president at Marlboro in the mid to late 90s before you even turned 40. And very interested to hear your perspective on the evolving nature of the role, the demands of the job and how they've changed, but also in the work that you do in professional development for new presidents. What advice do you give to new college presidents and aspiring college presidents?
Sure. So let me start with that one. This is a favorite topic. I teach from time to time in Judy McLaughlin's program at Harvard for new presidents. Probably two primary pieces of advice. My list is long, but I'll give you some of my favorites. So one is, when you arrive, presidents are the cheerleaders in chief of their institutions, right? So you run into any group of presidents, like when I run into my colleagues, and I say, how's it going? Even if I know that person is like facing a vote of no confidence, deep in the red, the board's ready to fire them, the answer's like, great, things are going great. Like, that's what we are. We're cheerleaders outside. But I would say inside, you have to be the most hard-nosed critic of what you have. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't read the press clippings about your institution. Be really hard-nosed. And as a new president, treat it like you just took a seat at a high-stakes poker game. You've been handed 5 cards. You got to figure out, what are my best cards? What are the cards I can play here? And what are the cards that I got to get out of my hand or aren't going to be helpful to me? And play your best cards. So when I came to this institution, you know, a wonderful little school that had a very deep sense of mission. When I say wonderful, it was really rooted in its mission of helping underserved people. And it actually has its DNA, not in traditional students. It had its DNA in non-traditional students. When people didn't do that, we didn't even call them that. And I looked at our little 18-person online division. I thought, this is one of my best cards. Like, I could look, online was taking off among the for-profits. The not-for-profits were looking down their nose at it. I could have spent years trying to get to look like Babson or Bentley. But I said, no, this is our card. This is something I can run with. And that's what we did. So the first is really understand the card you've been dealt and be hard-nosed about it internally with your team. Know what you're about. Second piece of advice would be, when you're arriving, be an anthropologist. Because no matter what cards you think you're going to play, and no matter how much you're clear, to the degree to which you're clear on the game plan and the roadmap, go in as an anthropologist and understand the culture, where the power lies, who are the heroes, who are the villains, what is the story the place tells about itself, what are the words that it loves, what are the words that are hot buttons. You really have to take the time to learn. And you do that by listening to the stories people tell. You do that by walking around and meeting everybody. You do that by giving people a lot of voice. It's a good thing to do anyway, because everybody wants to meet the new person. But it's a way for you to think about, okay, I know what the roadmap is logically, but culture isn't logic. And now I've got to navigate the waters of culture here. And I've got to bring those two things together, right? And that's, I think, so important. And oftentimes where people get tripped up. It was a great piece of advice to me. It was really spend the time to understand, as an anthropologist does. So when you're persuading people to do a hard thing, evoke the history. Evoke those times when they did hard things. Evoke the heroes of that story. Right? Use the language that matters to them. Rooted in mission. And always back to mission. I mean, that's, this is why we do what we do. But yeah, among many things. But those would be 2 primary pieces of advice I would give to people.
Well, the position of a college or university president, as we know, tenures seem to be shortening. The average age of a college president is getting up there. Where are the future college presidents going to come from? And where should higher ed be looking for them?
So higher ed has long been pretty traditional about where it looked, which means that we hire a lot of people who came up through the academy because we think, and I think this is hubris, we're so different that you have to come through the academy to really get us. I think people, when they don't come up from academia and they don't act as anthropologists, they get themselves in trouble. They use the language that doesn't resonate. They don't talk about student success. They use customer success. It's the same thing. But if you use customer success with academics, you get skewered. If you talk about student success, everyone's on board. You can talk about exactly the same thing, right? So, but I think because we've hired historically through the academy and we follow the same pattern, where we're too male, we're too white, we're too old, and we're too deep-seated in ways of doing the way and operating the way higher ed has always worked. And by the way, all those things probably describe me. right? But I've had to sort of break from think differently about the world. So, I don't know where, I want to think about your question about where will that come from, but I know increasingly who they should be, right? Mm-hmm. So in leadership positions for our women, our board has committed to 50-50 gender balance on our board. It makes a difference. They need to be much more diverse. We have a important commitment to hiring a more diverse set of candidates, and diverse in all of the ways, but certainly color and ethnicity, but more ways than that. So I think it is not for lack of great people. I think it's a combination of our culture of leadership in higher ed and our systems of leadership in higher ed. And then the last thing I would say is we need to look further afield. There are lots of brilliant people out there, and there are brilliant people in the tech industry, and there are brilliant people in healthcare, and there are brilliant people in NGOs. I think lawyers ought to make great presence. I love engineers as leaders, right? The way they think about problem solving. And it doesn't mean that that's the one thing they can hang their hat on. They have to be good at a lot of things. And the first one is understanding the institution they're seeking to lead. They have to be real, they have to have passion for it. But I think we have to look more broadly. Our issue is not a lack of great people. Our issue is how we look and where we look.
Mm-hmm. I also love, Paul, how you talked about the importance of being a chief cheerleader or chief storyteller and explaining the why, especially as you connect to mission in so many ways and getting to the heart of that, which is so important when you talk about innovating and change, to be able to tell those stories during times of change. How over the years have you honed that skill of being a campus's chief storyteller?
Yeah, I think I always wondered how many leaders in higher ed were English majors. And not because English majors are particularly talented, but they're people who are steeped in narrative and think a lot about language. And I was an English major, so I think a lot about language. And I'm so convinced at the obvious, which is human beings are story-consuming machines. We love stories. Nicholas Kristof said, you can give people absolutely horrifying statistics about a famine, and they'll be thoughtful about it and they'll feel bad about it. But if you give them one compelling story of an actual human being, they'll actually open up their wallets and do something. You may remember, Rob, to remember the very famous photo from the Ethiopian famine of a child with a vulture in the background. It's one of the famous photos of the 20th century. That photo changed world opinion. The baby, the 5-year-old, washed up on the shores of Greece, a refugee from the fighting in the Middle East. It galvanized world opinion. Now, we could argue about how much change it affected, but people want stories. We consume stories. We're wired, right? We know we're wired for stories. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the stories that rally people behind, the things we do. And those stories, again, have to be rooted in mission. They have to be compelling. It's the storyteller in chief job that may be most important, because it's in the storytelling that we evoke the values and the why. You said, it's the place where you address the why. And it's very hard for people. It's really not fair to ask people to do hard things, to go through change, to challenge beliefs they hold deeply, or practices they hold deeply, if we don't give them the why, right? If I understand and if it's rooted in things that matter, then I'll do hard things for you. So, you asked, how do you get better at it? Practice. Storytelling is a craft, right? The way you get better at writing is write more. The way you get better at storytelling is tell the story often. And I think really trying to be empathetic. The story is not about you, and the story is not about your singular way of seeing the world. Your story is about pulling together and making meaning from the fragments if you think about what it means to work in an institution like a university, there's a lot of stuff going on. How do I make sense of that for you, for where you sit? So, when I'm sitting with the folks in the facilities team, who, in the hierarchy of academia don't sit at a high rung, right? We value degrees earned, and we value publications, and we value a lot of other things. And I say to them, there are moments every day when you're a teacher. You're every bit a teacher as I am. When you have a work study student on your crew, and that kid is struggling, and you're hearing maybe doubts about whether they should be here or not, that is a moment you should seize, and you're singularly well positioned to do it. You're the adult in the room at that moment, right? And great teaching is about those moments. It's unlocking for students, right? Unlocking understanding, unlocking opportunity, unlocking motivation. And that feels good, and I don't do it to make them feel good. I do it to make them, I'll rephrase that. I want them to feel good about their place in the mission. So one of the things that, we have been on the best colleges to work for list every year since its inception, usually in the top 10 for our category. We've been on the honor roll every year. But one of the things that just makes me smile ear to ear is that among the very highest rated items on the survey that they use, our employees say, I understand the mission and my place in it. That's gold, right? Like that's, it used to be when we started, it was our compensation. We had great medical benefits and we took good care of people, and we still do. But these things that are really, these are items of the heart. And people will do hard work if they're paid well. Bonuses have some impact on motivation for a while, usually a short while, right? But our people will run through walls for students here, and it's because of that deep sense of mission. I know the mission of this place. And we know what we're not. We're not an R1. We don't do research. We don't do D1 sports, right? Those are things that I'm not critical of them, but it's just about knowing what you're about and what your mission is. And we're really, for us, it's all about students.
Yeah, that's outstanding. I'll close here with a question, even though I have several questions about marketing. And Inside Higher Ed had a pretty detailed piece in October about Southern New Hampshire's work in this area and its spend. And your CMO offered some really valuable points about thinking about marketing not as a single moment in time, but as a continuum, that your most important investment is in the student experience and how every aspect of the student experience matters. And well, here are the things I'd like to know, and I'll let you, Paul, take it in whatever direction you'd like, but interested in your involvement in marketing, how you think about marketing, and what are the key measures of success that you are tracking when it comes to marketing and then strengthening the overall SNHU brand?
Yeah, so to the extent that, the president of a university or chancellor is a storyteller in chief, in some ways you're setting the North Star, right? Which is not the marketing plan. But, I think in leadership roles, particularly as you get bigger, like the last thing this place wants is me driving marketing, right? Alana, our CMO, she's forgotten more about marketing than I'll ever know. But what I do know is what we're about. I know our mission, I know the values, and I know I can set that North Star for her. In the military, they talk about commander's intent, which is a new way of thinking about leadership, which is not, I'm going to give you the plan and then you execute it. I'm going to give you the objective. I'm giving you the end goal. I'm going to trust you, right? We often say the person closest to the problem is closest to the solution. You and your team will get us there. So I think that's my role in this. And I love storytelling, and I care very deeply about the narrative that we create for ourselves, the narrative that we put in front of prospective students, and the narrative that we have out in the world. So I do get involved in the conversation, but at the appropriate level. And I try to stay out of the way of our marketing experts. And marketing, as you know, for us, it's SEO work, it's our digital strategy, it's certainly our television, it's our creative, it's our web presence, but it's stuff like page load time, and I don't have the faintest idea how to increase or make our pages, 1.5 seconds faster, but I actually look at the data and I know it makes a difference in terms of lead volume. It's lead conversion strategies. This is not the reason that most educators get in the business, right? Most of the people I know leading institutions are not interested in page load times and lead conversion strategies. I would argue that they better know about it, because you're not an English major. I'm not an English professor anymore. I'm trying to lead an organization. And if I'm going to serve as many students as I possibly can, that's our mission, then I need to understand enough about it. But I leave it to the hands of the pros. But in terms of the broad story, leadership should always be involved.
Great. Final question. I promise.
There are narratives about us, Rob, there will always be narratives about us, about every institution. The question is, do you arrive at a narrative by inertia and the way the world shapes it, or do you take a shaping hand? And I think it's the responsibility of leadership to really have a shaping hand in the narrative. And it only works if that narrative is authentic and genuine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Well, again, final question. Promise to circle back to books. So I want to do that and ask Paul if you had any book recommendations for our holiday shopping lists, either books that you've read in 2019 or ones that you're looking forward to reading in 2020.
Yeah, so I'm an avid reader, and if you go to the President's Corner blog, it's where I do my pop picks every month. So what I'm listening to, what I'm watching, and what I'm reading, and I love books, of course. So a book. So these are not the most comforting of books, but Colson Whitehead may be, for me, in the top 5 writers in America today. And I think he's redefining literature, not just African-American literature, but his book, Nickel Boys, which is a 2019 book, is superb, based on a true story. And his earlier book, The Underground Railroad, I think one of the most searing novels, maybe close to perfection for me, of recent vintage. A book that I just finished of somewhat older vintage is Eric Foner's A History of Reconstruction, which I thought I understood. And there's a long version of 700 and something pages. Full disclosure, I read the shorter 300-page version. But if you haven't read it, if you think you understand Reconstruction, it is once inspiring and heartbreaking, and it explains a lot of where we are today still, particularly in the questions of race and racism, and structural racism in America. And then the book I'm reading right now is an older book. It's A History of Modern Day Japan by Pyle, which is, I'm going to Japan next month and doing a sort of deep dive, so I want to understand the history better. So that's currently on my reading list. And a wonderful little book, if you love books, because you asked. It's a novella called The Uncommon Reader. I don't have the author in front of me, but it is a piece of delight. And it's really about the love of books, the power of story. Highly recommend it. You can read it in an hour. And if you love Downton Abbey or The Crown, I'm not giving anything away here, you will love The Uncommon Reader, which is about the Queen. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you for those recommendations.
My pleasure.
Paul Leblanc, President of SNHU. This has been a fascinating and enjoyable conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your time and your insights. Thank you for the work that you and your institution do to transform lives. And best wishes to you and your family over the holidays and in the new year.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's really been a delight. Best wishes to you as well and all of your listeners.
Thanks again. Thank you, as always, to M. Stoner, which produces Higher Ed Live and makes these episodes possible. Thank you to Platform Q Education, and thanks as well to today's episode sponsor, RHB. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Higher Ed Live Special Edition on the Higher Ed Live Network, and happy holidays.